North Atlantic, March 17th, 1942. The ocean wasn't just cold, it was alive, hunting. Waves slammed against steel hulls like fists, while fog hung so thick it swallowed sound. Somewhere in that endless grey, invisible eyes were watching. German U-boats, the silent wolves of Hitler's navy. In just 30 days, hundreds of Allied ships had vanished. No flares, no survivors, just oil slicks and names crossed off the map. Every voyage felt like Russian roulette with the Atlantic. Convoys crept forward in terrified silence, crews whispering prayers over engines that could betray them with a single cough. But in the middle of this slaughter, hope came from a place no admiral would have looked. The ship's kitchen, not a command center, not a laboratory. A cook, surrounded by boiling pots and grease-stained walls, would stumble onto an idea so bizarre, so impossible, it would make Nazi submarine captains question their own eyes. Not a general, not a scientist. A ship's cook, armed not with weapons or theories, but with lard, foil, and an eye for patterns that no one else noticed. It sounds absurd. It should have failed. But somehow, against all logic, it worked. What you're about to hear isn't rumor or myth. It's a buried piece of naval history, once locked away in classified reports and forgotten by nearly everyone. To understand why one man's strange idea mattered, you have to understand what he was up against. In early 1942, the North Atlantic was hell on water. The German U-boats, sleek, silent, and ruthless, haunted the ocean like metal predators. They moved in packs, coordinated by radio and trained for the kill. Every night, merchant convoys leaving Canada or Britain crept through fog and freezing spray, hoping to outrun the invisible threat beneath them. At any moment, the sea could erupt. One flash, one explosion, and another ship would vanish into oil and flame. Hundreds went down that year alone. For the sailors who crossed that ocean, survival wasn't a mission. It was luck. Even Churchill later admitted that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. The Allies threw everything they could at it: sonar, depth charges, destroyer escorts, coded routes. But the ocean was too vast, and the submarines too good. The convoys still burned. And then, aboard one battered freighter called the SS Empire Belle, hope came from the unlikeliest corner: the ship's galley. His name was James Crum, a quiet man from Yorkshire who joined the merchant navy not out of patriotism, but because he needed work. His job was simple: feed the crew, clean the pots, stay out of the way. Yet he carried with him an odd skill from another life. Before the war, Crum had worked part-time as a stagehand in a small Hull theatre where he'd learned how lights could lie. He'd seen how a simple change of angle could turn a man's face into a ghost, how reflections could erase shadows or bend the eye's sense of depth. It was a curiosity that stuck with him long after he left the stage. One night in March 1942, as the Empire Belle pushed through thick fog near Iceland, Crum stepped out for air. The moon was weak, the sea like ink, and a cold wind howled through the rigging. The deck was slick with grease from the galley vents, and as he looked up toward the bridge, something strange caught his eye. The light didn't behave normally. The oily surface shimmered, twisting the ship's clean outlines into warped, uneven shapes. The steel seemed to melt into the mist. It was unsettling and yet fascinating. He stared at it for a long moment, and then a thought hit him with quiet force. Maybe the goal wasn't to hide a ship completely. Maybe the trick was to confuse the enemy into seeing something else. The next morning, Crum brought his idea to the chief mate. His plan was so odd, it sounded like madness. He wanted to coat parts of the upper deck in a reflective paste, a mix of lard, ash, and cooking foil, and attach bits of tin and pie plates at odd angles around the bridge and funnel. The purpose wasn't to camouflage the ship in the traditional sense, but to break its shape, to scatter light so the ship's outline would shimmer like a mirage. To a U-boat periscope, he argued, it might look distorted, or even incomplete. The officers laughed. One called it galley nonsense. Another told him to stick to soup. But the captain, a practical man with too much to lose, finally gave him permission to test it, just on the bridge, and only if it didn't interfere with work. That evening, as the convoy prepared for another dangerous leg, Crumb worked alone, spreading his strange mixture across the railings and walls, placing bits of foil wherever the moonlight might hit. To anyone walking past, it looked ridiculous, like some madman's decoration. But that night, something unexpected happened. As the Empire Belle sailed through open water, lookouts on a nearby escort ship noticed that the bridge section didn't look right. It seemed to shimmer, its angles uncertain, as if the metal were bending. The light around it looked alive. Hours later, British intelligence intercepted a German transmission from the area. A U-boat had sighted a convoy, but reported visual confusion and failed to fire. The captain of the Empire Belle wasn't superstitious, but he wasn't blind either. He ordered Crumb to expand his experiment. Over the next few voyages, the cook refined his strange method. He experimented with different mixtures, adding soot to absorb glare, ash to soften reflections, foil to scatter moonlight. The effect wasn't invisibility, it was distortion. The ship's edges no longer looked sharp or symmetrical. Through fog and night, it seemed to ripple like heat over asphalt. Sailors began calling it ghosting grease. At first it was a joke. Then, when ships treated with Crumb's mixture started surviving encounters that others didn't, the laughter stopped. Word spread through the merchant fleet. Crews copied the idea using whatever materials they had: grease, soot, tinfoil, even broken mirrors. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Ships with ghosting grease were being missed. Those without it were going down. No one could prove it scientifically, but results spoke louder than reports. By the end of 1942, several convoys were quietly using variations of Crumb's trick. Naval officers documented it under the name field distortion pattern, improvised. It was never officially recognized, but the earliest notes trace back to one name, SS Empire Belle. Historians later found that the technique worked for three main reasons. First, it confused the eye. U-boat captains had only seconds to identify targets through narrow periscope lenses. Distorted reflections disrupted those split-second judgments. The silhouette no longer matched the clean outlines printed in the Kriegsmarine's manuals. Second, it ruined range-finding. Torpedo targeting relied on estimating ship length and bearing. A warped outline meant incorrect data, missed shots, or early detonations. Third, it caused hesitation. Human perception isn't built for deception under stress. When a familiar shape looks unfamiliar, the brain pauses. And in those few seconds of uncertainty, the convoy kept moving. Crumb's method had no sound, no signal, no machinery. It was entirely passive, pure trickery of light and texture, built from nothing but instinct. By early 1943, internal reports noted a measurable drop in successful torpedo hits, about 17% fewer, on ships using reflective distortion patterns. It wasn't dramatic, but in war, margins decide survival. For the merchant sailors who faced death every voyage, even a small advantage meant everything. When the war ended, James Crumb returned to Yorkshire. He didn't talk about what he'd done. He never asked for recognition or reward. To his neighbours, he was just a quiet man who ran a cafe by the docks, serving tea and fish pies. His wartime idea remained buried in naval archives, forgotten until 1981, when a historian researching optical camouflage stumbled on a declassified appendix mentioning optical deflection tactics developed in merchant vessels. The notes traced the first field test to the Empire Belle. The BBC found Crumb still alive, in his 60s, living in the same town where he'd grown up. When asked about his invention, he laughed and said, "I just saw a shimmer and thought maybe Jerry will too." He died a few years later, still unknown outside a handful of naval scholars. Today, his odd discovery is recognized as one of the earliest examples of passive signature reduction, the same principle behind modern stealth ships and aircraft. What began with lard and tin foil became the foundation of an idea that changed Warfare forever. War remembers generals and admirals, but it often forgets the small hands that turned fear into invention. James Crumb didn't design weapons or lead men into battle. He just paid attention to the way light curved, to how reflections could lie. And in doing so, he helped save ships, crews, and convoys that might otherwise have been lost to the deep. His idea was simple, almost foolish, yet it worked because he saw what others ignored. A cook, armed with nothing but instinct, had outwitted the deadliest predators of the sea, not with power, but with imagination. The lesson of this story isn't that hiding always means vanishing. It's that deception can be subtle, clever, and entirely unexpected. What makes Crumb's tale extraordinary isn't just the brilliance of the idea, it's who imagined it. A cook. A man whose days were filled with chopping vegetables and scrubbing pots, standing alone on a moonlit deck, noticing how light bent across metal, and realizing that shadows could become shields. He had no laboratory, no rank, no authority, only sharp eyes and an instinct few would have trusted. History often tells the story of battles through generals and strategy, through plans drawn on maps and decisions made in war rooms. But sometimes, the turning points happen in the unlikeliest of places. The lower decks, the galley, the mind of someone willing to see the impossible. And Crumb's invention wasn't an isolated oddity. During the same war, entire forests were painted with false roads, decoy harbours rose from mirrors and canvas, and bagpipes echoed through Sicilian hills to trick enemy ears. These are the small, ingenious acts that tilt the balance, hidden in plain sight. Crumb's shimmering decks belong in that same hall of curious genius, a reminder that sometimes a war is won not just with guns, but with observation, patience, and audacity. If this story amazed you as much as it amazed us, hit that like button, subscribe for more hidden gems from history, and leave a comment telling us, should James Crumb finally receive recognition for his genius? And don't blink. Our next episode dives into one of the most daring spy networks in Europe, and trust me, pigeons play a starring role. Stay curious.